All right, welcome everybody to this ASHE presidential webinar. Excited to be with you all today. If you need closed captions, press the CC or closed caption button in the bottom of the screen and Zoom will provide the AI captions for you. Thank you all for being here. I'm Jason Gilbo. I use he and him pronouns. I am Executive Director of ASHE and I'll be your staff partner in this event today. I am joining you today from the lands of the Chitamacha. Uh, Throughout the session, please feel free to engage in the chat, including introducing yourself, sharing who you are, where you're joining us from. The presenters may or may not respond to you in the chat, just kind of depending along the way, but there'll be some questions, some time for questions at the end. Uh, this is, I think, our fourth or so presidential webinar. If you happen to miss the other ones, they've been recorded like this one is, and I just dropped the link in the chat to where those recordings are available if you want to go back and watch them or share them, or if you're still working on your syllabus or need more stuff for your syllabus, feel free to add them on there as well. I also want to remind people that we have our ASHE Events Code of Conduct that you agreed to whenever you registered. Ideally, we won't have any issues, but just in case we do, that is available. And feel free to reach out to me or email me if there are any issues that come up throughout the session. We also have two presidential webinars left. I will share the link for that. One is in partnership with the AAUP Center for Academic Freedom, and the other one will be hosted by this commission. And those are both coming out next month to wrap up this wonderful series. So with that, I will turn it over to Jorge to lead us for today's event.
Thank you, Jason, so much. And good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're at. I must say that as a former student affairs professional, I am particularly excited about this webinar and even more excited about the panelists that we've been able to recruit for this wonderful event. My name is Jorge Bermicki. I serve as an assistant professor of higher education at Howard University. My pronouns are he, him, his. And I am in this wonderful committee. We've had some really wonderful discussions already. And speaking of discussion, right after the panel, we will also engage in breakout discussions for those of you who would like to debrief and just have more conversation among colleagues. I know we all yearn for these spaces. So we've created some time with some questions that the facilitators will ask just to get the conversation going. Of course, we don't want it to make it overly structured, but we do have some guidance that you'll be provided and you will be placed on those breakouts after the panel, of course. And then we'll wrap up with a brief Q&A. And that is the agenda for today. So I hope you're excited because we certainly are. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and ask the panelists to introduce themselves. I'm going to pick on you, Cameron, just to get us started, just because you're right next to me on my Zoom box. And then we can just go in whatever order, and then we'll get it going. So thank you.
Thank you, Jorge, and thank you to the commission for engaging in this dialogue, and thank you all for making time today. For those of you who haven't had the privilege of meeting Cameron Beatty, I use the he series pronouns. I'm in Tallahassee, Florida at Florida State University, and it's on the indigenous lands of the Muskogee Creek Nation, the Seminole Tribe of Florida, and the Muskogee Creek Tribe of Florida. For me, I have many roles right now, but I'll highlight just a couple. Associate professor in the higher education program and the undergraduate leadership studies certificate. And I'm returning from sabbatical. And as I return from sabbatical, I'm serving in the role as associate department chair, which is always fun. So excited to engage with all of you. Jorge, maybe I'll popcorn and I'll jump to Alex.
Good morning, good afternoon, and perhaps even good evening to some of you. My name is Alex Lange. My pronouns are they, them, similar to Dr. Beatty. I have several jobs currently right now, but the most important for this space is I'm an assistant professor here in the School of Education at Colorado State University, where I also serve as associate department chair currently. Colorado State University is located on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. So with that, I'll pass it on to Katherine.
Hi everyone, Katherine S. Cho, pronouns she, her. I am also, as a continued trend, wearing multiple hats. While I am currently an assistant professor at Loyola University Chicago in higher education, which sits on the homelands of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi nations, I am also serving as the chair of higher education, our program and department. Through both of those roles, I'm really excited to be here and speak about how to share with students. And I will pass it over to Vijay.
Hello, everyone. Vijay Kanagala, use he, him pronouns, and I am coming from Salem, Mass, the land of the Noamkeg and the Pawtucket peoples. And I teach at Salem State University, which is a 4-year public regional institution, about 10 miles north of Salem, not to be confused with other Salems in the country. I am on sabbatical. So I just got promoted to full and I'm on sabbatical. So trying to figure out what I have to do. It's been one of those, I get anxious about not being able to do the things that I live about a mile from campus. So I see students walking to campus and it's giving me anxiety. But I'm here. I'm excited to be part of the group today.
Thank you so much. And in full transparency, we did not recruit panelists that have multiple roles. That was not the trend, or people that are freshly promoted because they're that amazing. Yet they are that wonderful. This just happens to be a pattern. And it's also no surprise considering our landscape. We're all wearing multiple hats. We're filling in for so many different responsibilities. So it's also not so unfamiliar to us. That's my guess. But congratulations to you all on all the wonderful things that you're doing. I know that your universities are very lucky to have you, that is for sure. Let's just jump in. The first question, we were very intentional about, of course, making this very student centered. So let's just start more broadly. What challenges from either federal or state policies do you believe are affecting students right now? And how are they shaping their experiences on your campus? In no particular order, feel free to jump in.
I'll first jump in. There's many, as we all know, and all of us could sit on this panel and have this discussion. So I really look forward to the small group discussion. For there's many, but I'll just name two, and then I know my other panelists will cover many other things. The first is the funding. I think is a huge part, right? So, grants have been lost, and that's huge. And students that were on grants are being supported by that particular funding. There's just a huge question mark and of uncertainty. And even students that weren't on grants are probably affected by lost grants because of the way that assistantships might have been granted or other funding opportunities like traveling to conferences and other things. So it's been difficult to think about supporting students and with their emotional uncertainty of just being funded, some for their livelihood, for their professional development or other things. I do want to say I'm in the state of Florida and all the things of hot mess of Florida, but I do want to acknowledge and shout out my dean. I think sometimes when I first got here, it was the perception that all the dean is doing is fundraising. And now being on the other side, I'm appreciative to his initiatives of fundraising because he got really creative. We have some centers on campus that were highly funded by USAID and also NSF funding, and those took really big hits. And some of those programs had assistantships for our students, and it was a responsibility of the department to then fund the students for the rest of the year. And thankfully, we were able to do that. And then we just got a note that the dean is going to reimburse us this year for that funding, so we can still support students to attend conferences and other things because of the private donors that he's been able to build relationships with. And I know not everyone is sitting in that privileged position or able to do that, but I'm appreciative to leaders that have gotten creative during these times, and then we can address some of those uncertainty and those feelings that students are feeling and facing. The other is the misinformation around what students can now do or research and their protections around that has been another experience I think that is really affecting the student experience, specifically the graduate students, both master's and PhD and EDD students. They're like, oh, well, can I research that? And I'm like, yes, you can research that. And how do we communicate that to them when thinking about, they might not have or feel they have the protections of academic freedom. Many of our EDD students are working full time, some working in school districts where they don't feel like they have those liberties to do, say, or research the things that they would like to do. So being able to clearly communicate what we can do as a faculty, what support that comes from the program, and some other things. And also pushing up against the bull crap that is circulating specifically on campus, right? So for me, IRB is another one that's saying like they shouldn't be pushing back on research topics, or their thing is to think about protecting human subjects, ethical research, and what are the parameters. And when they start to overstep that line, those of us that have some either academic freedom protections or some privileges around campus, we need to hold those things, people and institutional structures accountable. Like that's not your role in this process, and really thinking critically about that. But through all of this, it's getting really muddy and muddled. And I think that's impacting the student experiences and the student approach to understanding the research and the research they can do. And I'll pause there.
I can jump in, particularly sort of building off of what Cameron is sharing. I think particularly in the latter aspect of the misinformation, the emotional uncertainty, and I really appreciate Cameron naming this. I think for me, one of the main areas is the burnout of like, where are we going from here? What are we doing from here? I think the emotional students' emotional capacities have infinitesimally increased. And the current context is so overwhelming that despite how much people's capacities are increasing, it cannot meet the current context. And so much like I think many of our students, or a lot of different students, right? I work predominantly with master's, PhD, and EDD students, all of whom have full-time student affairs jobs. And so when they are thinking about research, when they're thinking about classes, they are coming in already having burnt out throughout the day. And so, and that is tied to, I think, the second area, which is the rapid political context and the changing of that. As many of you know, Chicago is currently in the news in terms of ICE pressures and the blitzes that are happening. And so there's misinformation about what policies currently exist, as well as the anticipatory concerns of what policies we need to be getting ready for. And all of that is creating not only, I think, situations where students and I think faculty, staff, sort of everyone involved with colleges and universities are like, how do we respond to this? What can we be doing? And we all sort of feel like we're running around without clear direction. But in that, it's also then creating very concrete challenges with the changing landscapes of our international students. What does that mean for our visas? If students are too scared to come to campus, how can we get I-9s to be able to, or even if students don't have I-9s, how are we then processing payments? And so I similarly have been really appreciating our senior administration in terms of how they have been trying to work around a lot of these concrete payment policy issues that have been particularly impacting students that I've been working closely with, and because of the changes in federal policies for finance that's happening.
I could potentially jump off on the idea that, or the point that Katherine, you were making in terms of the federal administration targeting big cities, right? So I live close to Boston. Boston is after Chicago, Boston is the next, I guess, the area that ICE is coming to. And like I mentioned, we're a regional institution, so a lot of our students come from this neighborhood. And I live in Salem State, and Lynn is a town about 2 miles from where I live. And in the last few days, we've had ICE, stationed all over that town. And we have a significant population of our students coming from that city, right? And Salem State has just became an MSI, it's a Hispanic Serving Institution. And we were ready to actually apply for federal designation, right? So our numbers have I think it's like 26, 27% Latino right now who are getting ready to apply for our designation. But of course, obviously, with everything that's happening with the Department of Ed, that's on hold. But at the same time, when you have ICE stationed on regular streets, right, where students are taking buses or trains to get to school, um, our enrollment hasn't dropped yet, but that's a concern that we have, right? That eventually students will stop coming to campus because, and again, based on what happened yesterday, day before with SCOTUS ruling, that anybody who's, Latino, speaks Spanish, works a low-income job, that is a lot of our students. Students at Salem State have 2, 3 jobs, not on campus. They work in the community, supporting their families. And if they get stopped coming to school, then that is an issue that we're going to have to deal with. And that's on the horizon. We've had students, and this happened with one of our students on campus, where campus police stopped a student um, for a traffic violation, but ended up being an undocumented student and then got put into all kinds of issues with federal administration. And so now the school is having to rethink what kinds of issues that they want to pursue. Thinking about whether we stop students because there's a broken tail light on college campus, or leave that to the state and the federal police officers. So that's one thing that's coming up. And very similar to that, we talked about finances, but because of our HSI designation, we were hoping to fundraise private versus now also through federal dollars, but all of that is now on hold because we just don't know if people will get into trouble. And so the administration is taking a very pause, wait and watch kind of approach to federal funding.
Yeah, I think my co-panelists hit on a lot of things that are feeling. I think in many ways, students are feeling uncertainty, anxiety, fear, and to some degree terror right now, right? And it really depends on, we're seeing it sort of a state-by-state difference in how students in some ways are having to respond to these issues in ways that we have not seen education policy in the United States sort of shaped at the federal level really doing these kinds of things to students and causing these differential outcomes. I think as some of my co-panelists have said it right, like we are seeing undocumented students and international students on visas have a great deal of uncertainty of, can I go to college? Can I stay in college? And can I go at the same price as the people I grew up with in the same state, as we're seeing attacks on in-state tuition rates for undocumented students at this point in time. We're seeing students who are at more prestigious institutions who often get the most attention in national media, see turnovers in leadership and capitulation to the federal government's efforts. So I think George Mason University's president is a really good example of sort of a counterexample to that in many ways. And many of them are frustrated by this sort of extensive oversight of the federal government at this moment in time. There will be those who will argue that the federal government has been doing this for over a decade in some ways with different policies, but we've never seen it to this extent and this quickly without due process. That is the real big difference here that really deserves to be highlighted. I think a lot of students are also just dealing with the uncertainty of, is college worth it? I think for many of us in this room, we have read the overwhelming evidence that for most students, college still actually brings a host of long-term financial and personal benefits, but there is a media ecosystem and an algorithmic structure that any one individual study gets propped up, countering that evidence despite the overwhelming evidence the other way, right? And then you add on top of that, I think, state laws curtailing speech, controlling classroom content, and effectively restructuring universities to determine what content, subjects, and even work should and should not be allowable in college settings, right? All of this is creating a real culture of uncertainty and instability for folks. And then there's the stuff that's not about student identities that is also coming up, right? We're seeing added administrative burdens to SNAP and Medicaid benefits for students who access those resources predominantly at community colleges being interrupted or just being piled onto. And then I think, as my co-panelists have lifted up, we've even seen the Supreme Court sort of say racial profiling is allowed, but not racial uplift, right? Those things are now sort of one's on the table and one is not. And then I think what also is affecting the student experience that is visible to more of us who have worked in these institutions for a long time than for students, but will affect the student experience, particularly in the coming years, is as states have to make up the Medicaid shortfalls that are no longer coming from the federal government, state-sponsored institutions in many ways are going to receive less funding from their states, and hard cuts are going to be made, right? We're already seeing in states like Indiana and in Texas, real sort of partisan lawmaker direct action at these institutions to change them in some way, shape, or form. We're seeing this example of the dean and department chair who were fired from Texas, or put on administrative leave on at Texas institutions, right? All of this is going to affect the student experience in many ways. Even as someone who studies this stuff full time, it is mind-boggling to keep up with, and how students are managing that ecosystem is a complete different challenge.
Thank you, colleagues. Such good answers already. And Alex, I think the institution that you were referring to is Texas A&M, I think. Correct, yeah. So that was that's a great way to get started. We wanted to kind of get started more at the macro level, what's going on with the landscape and how it impacts students. Now we wanted to transition a little bit more into the micro levels, you know, specific to aspects of the student experience that we know that it impacts them on a daily basis. So for a little bit of context, we wanted to ask this question because we realized that everybody here comes from various institutional aspects, and as I think Alex was saying, different ecosystems. So we wanted to kind of acknowledge, you know, that diversity as much as possible. So when you think of your own students and on your campus, what specific aspects of the student experience come to mind? And can you maybe think of one or two that as an audience we should keep in mind or at the center of the discussion when it comes to supporting our students?
I can kick us off on this one. I think for me, it comes back to that uncertainty theme, right? My institution is located in the state of Colorado. We're a public institution with a Democratic trifecta in our state, House, Senate, and executive leadership. In many ways, our Attorney General has been sort of one of the attorney generals trying to sue the current federal administration often, right? And you would think that that would offer a layer of protection and certainty for students, and still it does not, even in this context, right? But we are in a very different kind of context than my home state of Florida, for instance. And so for me, it's thinking about the uncertainty students are dealing with. There's really no quick fix for that, right? That said, I've been trying to give students more certainty in the spaces I control and the processes I facilitate, like in my classroom and in my advising relationships. I think that oftentimes my desire for routine or structure is mistaken as an intention of escape, that I want to sort of like not think about things, when actually it's an intention for prediction. I think Katherine was getting at this in her comments, right? That like in many ways, you open the news the morning you wake up and something else has happened in the world that you have to make sense of. And I remember when I was in college, there were some big events that really like took over the conversation for weeks, but it wasn't the conversation changing every single day, right? And we as people, like as someone who studies human development, my gosh, we hate change. We loathe change. We only like to change if we want to change, right? And when things are feeling like they're constantly shifting, I think it's quite natural for folks to want something stable and something predictable. Let's just exhale a bit. It doesn't fix the uncertainty, but it lets us sort of face it with a bit more composure. And so for me, it's been about giving folks that sort of predictability, that stability in my classes, in my advising relationships as students are preparing for defenses, and other pieces to sort of give them a soft place to land for all the other places they have to go occupy when they're not with me.
There's a couple, but I mean, we talked about mental health and supporting international students. There's one that I think that I've felt lately, and it could be from research, but I think I've felt this directly from my advisees, is thinking about their voice and civic engagement, and to the point of like students questioning whether they even have a voice, if they can even speak up or protest because of the examples that have been made by many of our campuses on this call, but all the public news media attention to different protests on campus, or students speaking up, students getting expelled, students not being able to complete their degrees, students being deported for their freedom of speech and other things. And I think there's an opportunity. It's just hard to think about what that support looks like for students, because you can say contact your congressperson and they're like, hey, that ain't gonna fly the way that some of these districts have been redrawn or being ignored, folks not even holding town halls. Students don't feel necessarily empowered to civically engage. And to me, that's one the early steps of the downfall of a democracy, right? When folks can't fully feel like they can speak up because of all the things that they're going to lose if they do. So I've been really thinking about how do I, as an advisor, as a faculty member, as a leader in the department, think about building folks' capacity for advocacy in whatever that looks like for their sphere of influence and for their communities. And then them also having the knowledge to combat the misinformation, right? So you can combat some misinformation, or you can at least push up against misinformation that's being spread within your family, then within your friend group, then within your sphere of influence, and thinking critically about you making sure that you are informed and who and where you're getting your information from. And then the advocacy part is the part that I've been really thinking about of empowering folks to what does that look like in this day, time, and age when the civic engagement and people feel like they're losing their voice is and folks have other ideas. I know Crystal, you have really been thoughtful and strategic about what that looks like. But I've been struggling with supporting students around that aspect of them having some advocacy for themselves in this, when before I felt like we could give recommendations or give advice, and now that students are like, what is that, and what does that look like in this context?
If it's okay with y'all, right, I'm going to expand the student. I think the question was, how can we be attentive to students? And I'm going to use an example or an experience that I had this past spring semester, end of spring semester into summer, working with a student at another institution in the Boston area, who also happens to be a family friend's daughter, right? And I want to expand the question to not just students, but also families, because students in this moment, when student activism is taking off, like, and it's much needed. The consequences of being an activist on a college campus, when institutions turn to be colonial projects, and the impact that it has on student conduct, for example. And in this case, these were students that were working on a college campus, private institution, right around the time that the federal administration took oath of office power. The clampdown was happening. The students protested in downtown Boston, and a faculty member happened to take pictures of the students, and that got into the student conduct process. The students were RAs on campus, so they lost housing. They were kicked out of housing, and then they were put into student conduct process, and then they're all on probation right now, right? And so they're one step away from getting dismissed if they continue with the activism. And they were all asked to write an essay, and I was involved with this process because, one, the parents didn't know. They live across the country on the other side of the coast. And for the parents, it was like they believe in, let's say, Free Palestine and the movement, and they want to support their student. But at the same time, they've paid $70,000 for the kid to go to school. And how do we support the parent, but also support the student? And how can institutions also manage all of the things that they have to do to, whether it's the federal oversight, the state oversight in some instances? Obviously, I live in Massachusetts, a blue state, so less of that intrusive clamped down from the state, but obviously federal. But in this case, the student was asked to write an essay and to reflect on what it means to be an activist and how can they be a good activist, right? So that you don't disrupt anything. And I'm like, but this is coming from student affairs. And so I'm caught in this dilemma of how do we work with our own student affairs colleagues to support our students to do the right thing. And what is the right thing, right? And that is up for debate, depending on who you talk to. So that's something that I wanted to bring into the conversation for us today.
I think so. I mean, I have so many thoughts, sorry. But I think one of the things, sort of building off of what everyone has shared thus far, one of the, and maybe because we're all researchers to some extent, right? Like we fundamentally believe that knowledge has power, right? And so so there are two things that I've been trying to do. One is helping and having conversations with my students, both in the capacity as a faculty member, instructor, advisor, but also now as our program and department chair, to be like, how do we push the boundaries and shift and expand our view of activism to community organizing and building coalitions and what that looks like. And so I'm just going to briefly drop in the chat, like, there are multiple different types of models, multiple different types of layers. I do have some research about the parallels of community organizing and campus staff in particular, if anybody's interested. But this frame and social change map has been particularly helpful for me because it offers a lot of different ways that people can be involved and also takes, I think, an approach that isn't also aligned with ableism, because oftentimes traditional ideas of how we think about protests and demonstrations are also very ableist, right? And so I've appreciated this as different ways to be thinking about precarity, and that ties to the second thing that in terms of like thinking about knowledge and power and what could our roles be, is really explaining with students like what is precarity, what does precarity look like, and as a result that changes how people are going to show up to spaces and what are the avenues in which we can operate. So to Vijay's example, multiple campus staff and a lot of campus staff, including students who have these roles or are in student affairs, right, are tied to these staff handbooks, much in the ways that students are also tied to code of conduct handbooks. That back to what Alex had said, right, like very little due process for any of these revisions and things like that. And so encouraging students that some of the best ways that we understand what we can do and the lines that are there is understanding these handbooks left and right. And so do I like this? No. But I also think that it's important for us to be equipping students for like, these are tools, and the very tools that are going to be used against you, you need to know what those tools are. And through that, it also has illuminated to us how handbooks get changed overnight, or when they are online, that there is no saved archive of them. And so equipping students to be like, you need to save the version that you got, because that's the one that you need to bring up against, right? And so those are things, to be clear, this is not legal advice and I'm not a lawyer. I feel like I need to very clearly state that. But I do think that those are ways that I've tried to equip students, particularly in thinking about knowledge. And then the third, I know I said two, but like any good faculty member, I'm going to ignore that and say there's a third. The third part that I've tried to help explain, right, is that in general, and I'm included in this as well, like I'm not great with history, and I tend to be very US centric in like what my knowledge is, right? And so I've been trying to be better about like, where have we seen this in history before? We've been here before, and it's unprecedented times, right? And both can be true. And so going back to particularly difficult moments in US history to think about how have communities, especially marginalized communities, survived in these spaces, what are lessons we can learn, but then also thinking about where are places in the global South in particular, right, and the global majority, in ways that we have seen communities surviving spaces that are increasingly / are under fascism, right? And so those are ways that I've tried to think about, like in my primary role of like a knowledge producer, connector, conduit, how can we use all of these different facets of knowledge and then be explicit about that given the positional privilege that I have. And so those are some of the, I think I veered off from the question, Jorge, I'm sorry, but I'll conclude there.
Well, I was just going to say that you gave me the perfect segue for the next question because you've already kind of been on sharing some tools and resources and strategies, which is actually what the next question is about. So thank you, Catherine, because that was a nice transition. So one of the things we really wanted to make sure that we empower our audience with strategies, tools, that they can use in their day-to-day work to continue to support students. So based on your experience, and you've already provided so many great examples, what specific resources, tools, can you share with us that have been quite helpful for you to support students?
I'll start. I'll start small, and then people accept it. I'll start kind of. For me, it's really thinking about continuing to enhance my own identity conscious practices in advising, in teaching, in mentoring, in supervising, and really understanding that what's currently happening is impacting all of us, but it's impacting us all differently and at various levels, right? And really being a much more intentional about the ways that I check in with students and colleagues, right? So think things that around visa issues. If if you're not looking for a visa, you'll have no idea what the policy is, or it's not impacting students. But those students in the midst of it, this is a crisis. This is a crisis for them, right? And thinking really critically about what that broader support looks like, not only for that student that's in crisis, but for the peers that could be a support system for that student, but don't understand what the crisis is, and helping them to really think critically about what that looks like. The other is challenging my colleagues in ways that they can be more identity conscious in their practice of advising and of teaching. And I think we do a disservice when we ignore that for many of us, the world is burning down, and we want to normalize or feel normal or ignore. And I think some of us do that because, we are trying, it's a survival, like we're trying to survive. And we all need to survive in this. And I understand that, and I agree with that. Also, and some people don't have the privilege to ignore. And we need to take that into account when we are advising, teaching, supporting students. The other side of it is, I think, our research-based frameworks, and what do we need to be thinking critically about? Number one, to understand and capture the times that we're in. And number two, to understand and capture for purposes of not only documenting, but also understanding that we might not be going back to what we've always known. And if we are to be in a space and to move forward, what frameworks are going to help us do that? And how do we amplify those and bring those to the forefront in our work? So I'm going to pause. I'll pause there.
I think for me, the couple things I will offer. One, as someone who used to work in direct services before I worked in higher ed, the best way to support others is to first support yourself, right? Last night I was making dinner and listening to a podcast, as I often do when I make dinner, and someone said, like, we're still under a year of this new administration, and I just like almost collapsed in the kitchen. I was like, oh my gosh, right? Um, and I was really overwhelmed by that. And I'm really grateful to have a therapist to talk to about what I'm feeling and how it's affecting me. I was talking to a friend the other day who was sort of like, I don't even know what to talk to my therapist about anymore. Like, everything is terrible, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, yes. And when I have those moments with my therapist, we pivot to something else we've been working on, right? Like, there are ways to attend to our own health and wellness during this stuff. Finding a colleague to grab lunch with, to have those hard conversations that Cameron's pointing to, but also to find humor in the day. So investing in your own care, I think, is really critical. Beyond that, I think the best resource I've been pointing students to is in many ways been their student governance units on campus. In many ways, student governance has not been touched the way that faculty governance has been touched. That's not true across the board by any means, but that's many of the services student governments provide, such as free legal aid and other pieces, have some layers of protection to them that other sort of institutional units do not. And this is a great time to remind students that those channels exist and that perhaps those channels can point them to other networks and other pieces off campus that we don't want to advertise quite broadly or loudly, right? I think I was listening to Dean Spade the other day talk about like the need again for underground networks at this point in time. And that's not Instagrammable, that's not sexy, that's not like, we don't actually want to talk about those things very loudly, right? But we want to know that they exist and to channel students into those resources to get what they need that they cannot get directly from campuses either anymore or couldn't to begin with.
I think we've talked about this, but I'll mention it again. In the realm of international students, right? We've talked about international students who are already in the country, perhaps, but I was a former program coordinator. I had to do recruitment and things like that. And something that last semester in spring semester, I had extensive contact and conversations with the students who are already here, international students, but also students who are applying, right? To not to deter them from applying and coming to the States, but also to think about what's happening here, because sometimes they may not have all of the information. And I think I had a moment with one of the students who's already here. She was like, if I'd known all of this was going to happen, I probably wouldn't have come here, right? Now, that's kind of like water under the bridge. You're already here. This is your second semester in the program. A part of me was like, I wanted to say, I told you so kind of a moment, but at the same time, that's not helpful for the student, right? They're here, we have to support them. And so part of what I'm focusing on now is the ethical dilemma of telling, having conversations with international students who are applying to come here, especially in higher ed. One, I don't know if you know, but H-1B visas are, that's on the chopping block, may or may not be there in a year from now, 2 years from now. OPTs are also on the chopping block. So all of these restrictions are going to come. And on top of that, students who graduate from HISA programs or SAHI programs or higher ed programs have challenges with visa sponsorship. So as program coordinators, faculty directors, we're recruiting international students as we tide over COVID enrollment drops. And I think programs have done a disservice where they've recruited students, but we're not able to help them find jobs on our college campuses. Like, for example, Salem State, I'll use my own institution. We're a faculty, all of the employees are part of a union. So whether it's staff, there's a staff union, there's a faculty union. But the staff union has negotiated where staff positions cannot be sponsored for visas. It's across all the regional state institutions. We have 9 institutions, and it's across all 9. And so I can recruit an international student to come to Salem State, but that same student could be the best in student affairs, but will not find a job to work at Salem State. And we had a conversation with our president about it, right? So again, I'm bringing up a challenge, not necessarily a strategy, but that's something to think about as you work with your students, depending on blue state, red state, purple state, whatever the color of the state is, in terms of the challenges. If I could also, a shameless plug, I'm putting this in the chat. My colleagues, Stephanie Bondi at Nebraska Lincoln, and Wen Transparson, who's at North Texas, and we worked on a book. It's an edited book that has about 17 chapters that looks at different ways in which we could support our students at the graduate level, right? So thinking about advising, thinking about classroom grading, thinking about faculty development, recruitment, all of those things are part of the book. So something for you to consider as you think about strategies to support students.
I think part of what we're doing right now of like sharing resources, like that's probably one of the more powerful ways that I've been encouraging students just to like get together because individually, and I think that's part of how we feel so burnt out and tired and what can I do individually? Well, of course, we are individuals, right? But when we come collectively and come together and provide time for us to be able to share resources, I think that that's one of the best ways to, there are links here that I've never seen before, other links that I am familiar with, but even being reminded of what resources exist, I think that's so helpful. And that's actually something that I am now building into time in class to be like, hey, if you all have some resources, what are some of the updated things that people have come across this week? Just to sort of build that in and remind folks, because I also think that in so many ways that community organizing is very unsexy, that a lot of it is about like care work, administrative tasks and stuff like that. Having a moment to be like, can we all update the Google Doc please together in this moment can feel sort of very rote and yet is so necessary. And so having even like this as an example is something that I think is really important for us to be doing. I also want to, because I love resources, part of this that I connect it with students is particularly like, how do we think about community organizing? Again, to move us not just from activism, which is critically important, to organizing, where it is really about centering relationships and care work and care networks. And again, I really sort of look at disability justice and women of color feminist activists who have really built these huge care work mutual aid networks. We saw them right at the start of COVID in 2020. But going back to that, I think is so centrally important. Other things that I think, in particular for doctoral students and master students who are sort of like, how do I write in this moment? I have loved sharing Mimi Cook's Writing While Adjunct, A Contingent Pedagogy of Unwellness. I think that it's been especially helpful. And Jorge is laughing because I have talked about this book nonstop. Mimi Cook has another book called Dear Elia, but it really is talking about how unwellness is not just something we wake up and we experience, but it is deeply reflective of the systems that we're in. And so understanding that, coming together, thinking of different alternatives, and in particular, the first link that I shared of how she talks about writing in these times, I think is just so helpful for students. And the majority of my students with whom I've shared this with have been like, I really feel seen in this moment. And then oops, sorry, I'm like trying to figure out how to share this while I'm talking. So this is, I have very complicated feelings about Spotify and I'm in the process of trying to boycott them. But my students and I, we started creating, speaking of podcasts to what Alex had referenced, podcasts are a way to also sort of not be on screens, but still get a lot of information. And so we created a Spotify playlist of just like different healing oriented, we called it tending to our gardens type of just audio things to be listening to. I am deeply behind on updating it, but this is, and please ignore my Spotify handle. I made it a long time ago. Actually, I'm very proud of it. It's DJ Catch-Up in case any of you were curious. I think those are sort of alternative ways to think about how to support and resources for that. And then yeah, I think I'll stop there. But those are just sort of like one sort of right off the bat where, again, I want to encourage students that like one of the best ways that we are able to resist and come together is like one in community, but also two to find those pockets of joy. And it feels hard because so much of the current context feels joyless. Preserving and protecting our humanity and finding joy in spaces is also important. And so I like to tell students the only thing the Academy asks for is our soul. And that's that's like the one thing we have to protect and not give up, right? And so protecting our soul means, going back to joy, being in community, nourishing our body and hearts and minds and all of those things. And those are ways that we can try to do soul-filling efforts in what feels like a very soulless moment.
That was so powerful. And by the way, we definitely need to capture all of the resources that were just placed on the chat box for us committee, because we are writing a report on this at the end of all the webinars. And I think what you've given us is so valuable that we definitely need to include on that report. So thanks, Roshana. She's already on it, of course. And Katherine, I love to see you come to life when you talk about these things because it's just so fun. And yes, I will never get tired of listening to you, especially talk about Dear Elliot. So very quickly, because we do want to transition into the breakouts. Let's, we really wanted also to create space just to resonate with each other and really just be humans with one another. What do you think, very briefly, what is the biggest challenge that you as a person are facing when it comes to doing this work? And I know it's a little bit of a personal question, but I think it's important because I know that there's so many people here that are going to resonate with what you say.
I think I'll use the example of what Alex had mentioned that happened at Texas A&M. I mean, obviously I teach in a school of ed. I'm hoping that the students that are in the classroom are folks that want to be educators, that are empathetic, compassionate, understanding. And there are times when I have to realize and recognize that there are students who probably are not like-minded, and that they have their own worldviews that I have to somehow accommodate and work with in the classroom. And how do I create an environment for students to kind of like work with differences, right? Differences in epistemologies of being, doing, whatever it might be. And I oftentimes think about, am I being recorded? Is that, I mean, I am in a pretty safe state, if you will, tenured, all of those things, protections that you have. But at the same time, do I want to be a viral video on TikTok? No. Right? So that is something that I think about. Not that it's going to deter me from doing what I'm passionate about, but I think about that often. And I often think about the colleagues in my department, my school, who are untenured or adjunct faculty that might get into challenging situations with students. So we've had conversations about how do we, work with each other? How do we support each other in our department when we have challenging situations like that? That's just one example that comes to my mind right away.
Similarly, it's the challenge of the tension with the federal state institutional policy with my own personal conviction, right? Like that is the biggest challenge that I reflected on over my sabbatical. And I took a year because I was like, a semester's a tease, and I needed to turn it all off, and I really needed a break. But then as I was thinking, I was like, well, what if I had to leave higher education, what would be my pivot? And I constantly thought about that for those 12 months. And then I went back to why do I stay when it's so challenging? And many of you heard me say this, and many of you feel this way. If I'm in the business of planting seeds and I'm no longer able to plant seeds, what is there left to grow is where I kind of have been landing, right? Of why, when I return to this, what do I want this work to be? And I've been thinking of what type of mentor do I want to be? What type of, all those things are to me the business of planting seeds. So the challenge is when there's tension with my own conviction, how do I stay true to planting seeds? And this was before the current administration, because I was dealing with the crap in Florida. It was like, there's people in Florida that want to do work. They want to do critical work, that want to do impactful work, that want to honor folks' humanity. And how do I be a beacon to support those students that want to do this work? And that's what I've been holding on to with addressing and facing that challenge of, but my personal conviction says this, and you want this institutional policy. And that's what I've been trying to hold on to. And it's been good. I've been back a month now, and it's been good. I'll take another sabbatical, but I ain't getting one. So how do I continue to plant seeds in the midst of these challenges?
I think for me, some of the challenges for this is that there's always this dichotomy, I think, between like, oh, you should do what I say, but not do what I do. And so, as we are encouraging students to center themselves, to be in community, this there's a small call-in and moment for reflexive praxis of like, are we doing those things ourselves? And I think that that's been very difficult. And as much as students and communities that I work with pay attention to what I say, they're very much paying attention to what I do. And so if I am not modeling the behavior that I want students to have, especially to center themselves and to, you know, not be working until like 2, 3, 4 in the morning, I think that's been a challenge, right? Of like, in order to ensure that students are not burning out does not mean that we should be burning out in their place. And that's not how that works. And yet the temptation is there because it feels like something that at least we have some semblance of control over. And so I think that that's been, particularly as I've been stepping into this incredibly chaotic administrative role, that's been sort of a central challenge that for me personally that I've been thinking through and dealing with, and in many ways sort of, you know, reflect some of the same challenges that we've already named that students are also facing, right? Of like, I feel burnt out about social media or things like that. So even, and I've told students, like, I don't check social media until the evening. So that way all the shenanigans of the morning have pretty much passed as much as possible, right? And that's like a practice that I do. And those are things that then we've connected over, but those are challenges that I also have to keep revisiting back towards.
I think the last thing I'll name pretty quickly is just mistrust and distrust, that we are in an environment where we mistrust and distrust institutions, not just of higher ed, but societal institutions, that we are not trusting our colleagues, that we have fears of surveillance, that we have fears of inspection and what that will mean for us, and just holding all of that, particularly in an era of artificial intelligence producing images and text where we're like, oh, should we have a debate if we should have a checker for students when they submit stuff to Canvas or our LMSs, right? Like there's just so much this sort of just environment of mistrust that has just really been hard to hold and manage, and just sort of say, why don't we trust people to do these things in many ways?
So powerful, and thank you. That was just so what I definitely needed to hear. I really needed to be in community here, and just there's just so many things that we have in common, and I really appreciate the knowledge and wisdom of our panelists. At this point, we're going to transition to the breakouts. Jason's going to place us into those breakouts, and each of the breakouts will have a facilitator, so don't worry about creating conversation. If you do, please do, but we do have some guiding questions. So Jason, we can do that whenever, and then we'll come back and bring it back if we have any time left for questions. We'll see how we do.
And we're doing 20 minutes.
Yeah, probably, because it's already, 20 minutes, and then we can leave 10 minutes for questions.
Sounds good.